welcome everyone. Appreciate you tuning in to us tonight, and we'll go ahead and get started here. The name of the program tonight is Not War But Murder, Malvern Hill and the 7 Days Battles in 1862. And Malvern Hill was the last of these 7 days battles. There weren't 7 battles, but there were 7 days of this battle for the city of Richmond in 1862. And the quote, "not war but murder," comes from one of the Confederate generals who saw all the casualties at that last battle of Malvern Hill and called it murder instead of warfare. The casualties were so heavy. So let's jump in here. Keta, if you would go to the next slide, please. The basics of the background is that this campaign was McClellan versus Lee. That's Major General George B. McClellan. And we'll talk about his background in a second, but he was the commander of the Union Army of the Potomac. And the idea of the campaign was to take the army and attack and try to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond from the Tidewater by moving up the peninsula between the York River and the James River, which would, by being so close to water, the idea was that supplying the army would be very easy because Navy ships and transport ships could deposit supplies quite close to the army. And that is, of course, General Robert E. Lee, who would become the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia on June 1st, 1862, and eventually his campaign to remove the Army of the Potomac from being so close to Richmond and defeat McClellan's army. This is really what culminated in the seven days battles. Next, please. So a little bit of background. The 7 days battles is part of the Peninsula campaign. This was, again, the Union campaign to move up this peninsula that was east and southeast of Richmond and be able to capture the city. There was a drive early on the war that became known as On to Richmond. In other words, if in 1861, 1862, the Northern armies, the Union armies, could capture the Confederate capital, then the Southern Confederacy would collapse, the war would soon be over, and that was that. Of course, that did not happen in 1862 or 63 or 64. However, McClellan was the commander of the Army of the Potomac. He had a very testy relationship with the Northern High Command, particularly President Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and other generals as well. But he was very, very cautious. He was very exact. He was a brilliant organizer. He was a brilliant motivator of the troops. The soldiers loved him. The army under him was pretty well organized, pretty well fed, and their health was good. But when it came to his generalship, he was very cautious, and he had a tendency, persistent tendency, to wildly overestimate the enemy's numbers, particularly at Richmond here during this part of the war. He often reported to Lincoln that the Confederates had 200,000 men at Richmond and that his army was too small to attack it, since they only had about 90 to 100,000 men, a little bit more at sometimes, but used that overestimation of the enemy's numbers, which gave him extreme caution, to constantly request more troops from Lincoln and the War Department, which they were not always able to provide. Now, one of the battles that happened on May 31st, 1862, prior to the 7 days battles, but influenced them significantly, was the Battle of Seven Pines, also known as Fair Oaks. And during this battle, excuse me, during this battle, you can see I put a red star where the battle is at Seven Pines. That's on the Williamsburg Road. That is, for those of you from the area, have been in that area, that's US 60. And it's very, very close to the Richmond International Airport. There's not much left there, battlefields. There's some markers on US 60, but This is where at the end of the battle, and the very complex battle between part of the Confederate Army and part of the Union Army, General Johnston, who was the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, was seriously wounded near the battlefield. And I put a little yellow dot there. I hope you can see that just north of that red star. Johnston was wounded there, had to be carried from the field. The victory, the battle was somewhat of a draw. Johnston's plan, which really was one of his only offensive operations at this point during his 10 years commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, basically ground to a halt with his wounding, and he was replaced with Robert E. Lee, who had been one of Jefferson Davis's chief military aide or consultant and advisor up to this point. So that was the Battle of Seven Pines. Next, please. Okay, the first battle of the actual 7 days is a result of Lee's planning. It was the Battle of Oak Grove. Most people don't know it. It's very small compared to the other battles such as Gaines' Mill and Malvern Hill. But what Lee decided was that he was going to try to offensively push back McClellan's army. And Lee and the Confederates knew that McClellan had more men, and more importantly, they had a significant amount of siege artillery. And McClellan's plan was to get as close as possible to Richmond and try to get the high ground nearby and start to bombard the Confederate lines around Richmond, bombard the capital itself, and eventually make the Confederates abandon Richmond so that he could capture it. A very simple plan, not easily undertaken, but that was a very basic plan. And Lee knew that if the siege guns got too close and McClellan dug in his army behind field trenches and field works, that would be very, very difficult for the Confederates to push back the Union army that was besieging Richmond and to destroy them. So what he decided to do was concentrate as many troops as he could near Richmond and to go on the offensive. So one of the things that he did was bring over a small army from the Shenandoah Valley that had been quite successful through the first week or two of June, and that was led by Thomas Stonewall Jackson. And that increased his numbers significantly, and Lee decided at that point, to start going on the offensive. Now, at this point of the Battle of Oak Grove, which is near the Seven Pines battlefield, McClellan actually moved offensively to seize high ground for his siege warfare artillery. And the high ground was just north of Seven Pines in an area on the 9 Mile Road, which is still there today. But the Confederate troops were able to prevent McClellan at that time, June 25th, the first of the 7 days battles, from taking that. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that's McClellan's picture there, by the way. But if we go to the next slide, a basic map of the battle. The yellow star is where the Richmond International Airport is today. So the actual battlefield is almost completely obliterated, except for some earthworks and some artillery cannon pieces that have been placed there today with markers. But the Union attacked from east to west, and the Confederates were able to prevent them from advancing onto the 9 Mile Road and past them, and therefore they did not meet their objective. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now we're going to take a look at this slide for a little while here, and this is about what Lee decided to do, again, because he knew that they could really not withstand a siege, a full-blown, engineer-operated, well-planned, artillery-supported siege. So what he realized was pretty quickly by intelligence and reconnaissance is that while McClellan's army was moving up the peninsula between the York and the James Rivers, and when I say up, I mean from east to west, they encountered the Chickahominy River, which, if you've ever seen that, especially in its upper reaches, it seems more like a moving swamp than it does a river. It's very difficult and swampy to get through. And there were a series of bridges, but many of them were poorly constructed. Some of them were destroyed. And what McClellan had done is he crossed with some of his troops, crossed the Chickahominy River toward the south, but in the north, on the north bank, he left other troops to advance, so that the Chickahominy River wound up splitting his army in two parts. Now, it wasn't two equal parts. The north side was smaller than the southern part. But this created somewhat of a dangerous situation, because with the swampiness of the Chickahominy and the precarious state of the bridges, there was really a very tough way. It would have been a tough way for him to support either side with a river splitting his army. That was a very a dangerous thing to do. Excuse me. Now, the one major force that'll feature in the next few battles we talk about that was north of the Chickahominy River was the 5th Corps, which was led by John Porter, who was a very capable general, West Point graduate, and one of McClellan's favorites. And again, as I mentioned before, Lee brought Stonewall Jackson's Army of the Valley over to Richmond, north of Richmond, by rail and by foot. Now, Richmond's defenses were pretty good. There were a lot of entrenchments that were guarding the city, and Lee had the men dig in the first 3 weeks of June, which they did not like, of course. But his purpose was to be able to create strong enough trenches so that he could leave a small number of troops there to defend Richmond, while he was going to move the bulk of the army north of the Chickahominy and attack Porter, because Porter was isolated. So that's really Lee's position in a nutshell in the second and third of these 7 days battles, which we'll talk about now. But the objective was Porter's isolated, and the Confederates were going to attack them in that isolated position. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so the first, don't worry, the map, I know the map's small. I've got a better map coming up. I just wanted to use it as an illustration. This is actually a period map done during the Civil War of the area around Beaver Dam Creek on June 26th. And that was the first of the 7 days battles. This one, as far as active troops involved in the fighting, Porter's troops were numbered 15,600. The Confederates a little bit more, as you can see, but Lee had planned on having a lot more of his army involved, which they were not. This is a telltale sign that we'll talk about in a second of what it's like to take over an army of amateurs, really, that had not really done a lot of large-scale maneuvers and coordinated attacks. In the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you can see the red star. That's where the town of Mechanicsville is. And oftentimes this battle is referred to as the Battle of Mechanicsville. The 5th Corps on the right was Porter. The Confederates were going to come from the left. And the large watercourse at the bottom is the Chickahominy River, and the other smaller stream that runs from the top of the map into the Chickahominy, that is Beaver Dam Creek. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek. This is hopefully for you a little bit easier to follow. You can see through the middle of the map here, running from the top left to the bottom corner on the right. I've highlighted that in blue. I hope you can see that. That's the Chickahominy, and you can see that Porter is the only one north of there behind Beaver Dam Creek. And I've also highlighted Beaver Dam Creek there in blue. And so the basic plan, without getting bogged too much in the details with the time we have, is that Lee was going to have some of his forces led by A.P. Hill cross the Chickahominy and move on Porter in front of his position at Beaver Dam Creek. And I've put in red Beaver Dam Creek with an arrow. Up at the top of the map, you can see Jackson next to the yellow star. Jackson's role was to bring his troops in behind Porter's right flank and into his rear, and therefore be able to destroy the Fifth Corps against Beaver Dam Creek and the Chickahominy, while Confederates under A.P. Hill, whose picture is there on the right, D.H. Hill, and Longstreet would cross the Chickahominy and assault Porter head on. So Jackson's role was to get in the rear of Porter and act as a way to destroy Porter. So let's go on to the next map, or the next slide here. So at Beaver Dam Creek, it was a small affair, especially compared to several of the battles that we'll talk about in a minute. The problem was that Jackson was very lethargic, and to this day, historians argue what was wrong with Jackson. Why was he so slow? Why was he having trouble getting to places on the battlefield where Lee expected him to be? Some historians argue that he was very fatigued from the campaigning in the Shenandoah Valley, that the march from the Shenandoah to the 7 days battles area took a lot out of him, took a lot out of his troops. Other historians argue that Lee should have assisted Jackson with officers who were very familiar with the area, to have a staff officer with Jackson to relay information and to explain the plans. But really, Jackson was missing. He seemed to be really in kind of some kind of a funk where he didn't understand. He was not fast moving, took the wrong roads, or didn't explain anything to his subordinates. And for those of you, especially who've studied the Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1862, his hallmark was fast movements and lightning strikes and popping up at the most unexpected places. And for that not to happen throughout the 7 days is really one of the main questions on why that had happened. And it turns out that on several occasions, including Beaver Dam Creek, his failure to get in behind the lines meant that Porter was able to leave the battlefield and take up a position by retreating to the next battlefield. Now, another question is, where was McClellan? One of the most interesting things about McClellan in his entire career, throughout the war, throughout this period, is that he didn't really show up at the battlefield. He directed troops from his corps commanders and divisions from his headquarters south of the Chickahominy at the Trent House, and arranged for supplies, ammunition. He had a battle plan and directed the generals what to do, but he rarely showed up during the actual battles to direct troops and support and reinforcements and changes in plans and contingencies. He just simply wasn't there. So this was a Union victory in that the Confederates were repulsed at Beaver Dam Creek. Beaver Dam Creek was very swampy also, and the Southerners were not able to really get at the Union lines, which had significant artillery support. So Porter retreats, and let's talk about that, because that's going to lead us to our next battle. And that is Well, we'll talk about that in a second. The next battle is Gaines's Mill. But let's talk about McClellan again. He decided. Let's go. We're one screen two. There you go. Let's stay there. So let's talk about McClellan again. McClellan realized that Porter was in trouble, and so ordered him to withdraw. And he finally decided that because the Confederates outnumbered him, they didn't, but he thought they did. Rumors were that they were getting more reinforcements from the south. His army was straddling the Chickahominy, which he realized at this point was a dangerous situation. So he basically decided to abandon at this time his plan to capture Richmond. He was concerned about Jackson coming in, and so what he did was take the number of Confederates estimated at 200,000 and compared them to his 100,000 and begged Lincoln for more and more troops, which the Union simply didn't have. So he decided that the best thing to do was to withdraw back across to the southern side of the Chickahominy. The only problem is that his main supply base was north of the Chickahominy on the York River at White House Landing. So in order to withdraw to the south side of the Chickahominy, he had to abandon the White House Landing. And so he had to burn supplies, weapons, equipment, tents, medical needs, things like that. And he decided to change his base, which sounds a lot better than retreat, but essentially he was retreating from the north side to the south side, abandoning his main base at White House Landing and moving it to Harrison's Landing on the James River, very close to Malvern Hill. And those of you who have ever toured that area, if you've been to Berkeley Plantation on the James River, that's where Harrison's Landing is. So let's go to the next slide. So our next battle that we're going to be talking about is June 27th, and that was the Battle of Gaines's Mill. And I'll explain the map here to you. In the top left corner, there's a blue star, and that's just to show you where the previous Battle of Beaver Dam Creek was. So Porter withdrew to the east and slightly southeast, and his line there was along Gaines's Mill. And I'll show you a better map in a second. And the idea here was for the Army of Northern Virginia under Lee, on the left side at the top of the map, to attack Porter again, and you can see isolated on the north side of the Chickahominy River. And Jackson was going to come in from the north with D.H. Hill behind him, and Hill and Longstreet were also going to attack this position on the east side of Gaines's Mill as well, and press Porter against the Chickahominy and hopefully destroy his command, just like they were trying to do at Beaver Dam Creek. You can see that that there were some Confederate troops south of the Chickahominy under Magruder and Huger, and that's where McClellan thought the main attack was going to come from. Lee was ordering those two generals to make it seem as if they were going to attack by feinting and making all the motions and making it look like they were going to attack across the fields there, you can see. And so McClellan was very loath to send any reinforcements to the north side of the river to help Porter. So next slide, please. All right, here's a good map that shows the actual fighting, and you can see in the left-hand side of the map on the top is Gaines's Mill. That's what the battle is named after. Sometimes it's called the Battle of Bosun's Creek, but most of the time Gaines's Mill. The red arrows show the Confederate attacks. The blue positions are the northern troops under Porter. Now, he did get some reinforcements from the south side of the river under General Slocum, some cavalry, but one of the main strong points of Porter's position here is that this area that he occupied was elevated slightly. Was a great place for artillery, which he put plenty of artillery in on the hill and the high ground here. But also the fact that that the creeks there that you see that the Confederates had to cross were again very swampy. They disrupted the Confederate formations, and they became good targets for the Confederates. There were heavy losses here. Jackson again was able to bring in some troops, but was delayed due to taking the wrong road and not necessarily making quick and decisive decisions on what to do and where to go. But where the yellow arrow is where the charge of General John Hood's brigade really was what cracked the Union line here. This battle took place mostly in the late afternoon and into the evening, and Hood's men were finally able to make a charge along with Whiting's brigade and get into the Union lines and force Porter to retreat across the Chickahominy River by several bridges. But this was actually Lee's first victory because the Union Army had to retreat. There were heavy casualties on both sides, but Lee was able to defeat Porter, but not in such a way that Porter's troops were caught against the river and destroyed, which was what Lee's plan was. So there were heavy casualties, and one interesting thing is, at this point in the war, now this was before Second Manassas and Antietam and Gettysburg, but other than Shiloh, up to this point, this was the battle of the war that had the most casualties. This was the heaviest casualties since the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, a few months before, out in Tennessee. The frontal assaults Lee made were not finessed. This was a period where Lee seemed to have no problem ordering troops on frontal assaults. When he did order maneuvers to a flank, such as Jackson's role at Beaver Dam Creek, it did not work. So this was really one of his straight ahead attack. It's another example also where, other than in I believe the late morning for a consultation with Porter, after which he quickly returned to the south side of the Chickahominy, McClellan was not on this field. He did not actively try to reinforce Porter, to make some strategic decisions, to react to Lee's strong attack. Not there. So at the end of the day, Porter retreats across the Chickahominy River, and that photo there, that image, is the ruins of Gaines's Mill that was taken during or right after the war. So let's go to the next slide. Here it shows the casualties. Confederate Army, 8,700 casualties in one day. Again, the South was very limited on what kind of reinforcements they could provide due to their smaller manpower. 6,800 casualties for the Union Army, significant, and it's even more significant when you consider that most of those casualties came from Porter's corps, only one corps of the Army. So they were rough handled here and had to retreat, but that 8,700 casualties on the Confederate side was a very significant proportion of Lee's total numbers here. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so this map shows the Battle of Savage's Station. That's our next battle in the 7 days battles on June 29th. Savage's Station was a rail station on the Richmond and York River Railroad. As what you can see going right through the middle from left to right in this map, the blue dot that I put in the middle there, that's where Savage's Station was. It was also near the Williamsburg Road, not too far from Seven Pines again. And this is where most of the Union Army had gone to after they were ordered to start moving back down to the James River. So you had several of the corps here. And what Lee wanted to happen here is I've put red stars next to the main Confederate units involved in this battle. What Lee wanted to do here was to have Magruder, as you can see in the middle star, move east along the Williamsburg Road and the railroad and attack Sumner and other units of the Union Army and hold them in place, and at the same time have Jackson attack the Union northern flank, and UG, who's the down there at the bottom of the red star, attack from the south and destroy the large portion of the Union Army from the south, from their left flank. So the attack was going to be against the Union corps led by Heintzelman, Sumner, and Franklin. Well, what happened was Magruder really didn't attack very much. He advanced until he met the enemy, skirmished at long distance, some back and forth for about an hour and a half or 2 hours, and then he withdrew. At the same time, Jackson really never got started and was basically idle all day. And again, his officers even said it was a curious demeanor on his part. He was in no rush, didn't seem to understand his orders. And then UG at the south and down south, he did not get in a position. He was somewhat of an incompetent. Eventually moved out of the Army of Northern Virginia, but the battle really was not what Lee was expecting at all. And this was a chance for Lee to offensively strike at the enemy in motion. That's always a dangerous time, particularly in the 18th and 19th century when an army is in column. They're spread out all over the place, and if you can concentrate your troops and hit part of that column either in the middle or at the end and destroy a huge section, that is always some type of chance you're going to take, but it did not pan out here. So let's go to the next slide. This is another image of the Battle of Savage's Station, which I've marked with a yellow dot. You can see the Magruder's troops moving here along the axis of the red arrow against Sumner's corps, but they were not successful in tying him down, mostly because of Magruder's either misunderstanding of his orders or incompetence, and Jackson did not get into the battle at all. So this map, by the way, I want to mention is courtesy of the Savas Beatty Publishing Company, who has definitely been supportive of our programming with maps, and this is one of the maps. So I want to thank them for using for letting us use this map. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So here, as I said, it was a missed opportunity. That's Magruder there in a very early war or pre-war image. He was an experienced officer and did well earlier in the campaign, but this was not his day. And McClellan, again, absent. And again, what we'll see again at the Battle of Glendale coming up is that he left no one in charge. Not only did he not show up on the battlefields and telegraphed his plans and orders from far away, but he was not leaving anybody in charge. At Savage's Station, he had 3 corps commanders for the Union Army, and they did not know really who was in charge and acted independently. So after this day's battle, the Army of the Potomac continued to move to Harrison's Landing on the James River, and we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, this is a map that shows, especially the top part of the map, the way that McClellan was bringing his army to Harrison's Landing. Harrison's Landing is down at the bottom of the map where the blue dot is. That's on the James River. And the next battle of the 7 days was what was called Glendale, or sometimes called Fraser's Farm. and we'll have a better map of or a more detailed map of the battle on our next slide. So this was another attempt by Lee to hold up the Union process toward the Harrison's Landing and attack the army in motion. And this was going to be a major effort to try to hit McClellan's army as they moved, and it was difficult to support them by their other troops. That was going to be Lee's next maneuver that he kept hoping to do so, but kept having difficulty getting a lot of his generals to either follow orders, understand orders, or simply get them moving at all. And as you can see, compared to some of the other battles, such as Oak Grove and Savage's Station, this was a major battle. Look at the numbers involved here. The numbers that would be on the field for the Union Army would be about 40,000 troops, and for the Confederates, about 45,000. And this area around Fraser's Farm or Glendale was a key crossroads that would allow the Union Army to cross the White Oak Swamp, move south through the Glendale crossroads, and take 2 or 3 different roads or paths around Malvern Hill and get to Harrison's Landing, where they would be supplied. There would be trenches and field works, and even supported by naval ships in the James River. Again, McClellan not at this battle. Didn't really leave anyone in charge specifically. Most of the time, Sumner assumed command because he was the highest ranking officer by date of rank. But this was a very large, sprawling event in woods and fields. Again, Lee's attempt to hold up McClellan's army and destroy at least part of it. Okay, let's move on. Okay, here you see the plan here was for the Jackson to come in from the north. You can see him on the upper right-hand side and cross the bridge at White Oak Swamp. And I've marked the bridge there. That swamp moves from west to east, very difficult terrain. And you can see that Franklin's troops were defending it. In the yellow dot, that is where the crossroads are of Glendale, Fraser's Farm area. And Lee planned to have UG move from White's Tavern, which you can see there, and hit the Union troops from his position, and while Longstreet and AP Hill would move against Fraser's Farm from the west and attack the Glendale intersection, hoping to catch the Union Army marching and destroy them as they could. Magruder was coming from the northwest to add support. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see one of the black lines on the left side. It says Holmes near Newmarket. He was to move south along the River Road and hopefully cut off a lot of the the Union troops who were moving toward the Harrison's Landing. So we'll get a look at the battle with the next slide. Now, this slide, don't worry about reading any names on this. This slide is an original watercolor map that was done at the time, or just after the battle. And many of the names especially the red that marked the Confederate Army, have kind of blurred and bled through. If you get a copy of this map digitally from Library of Congress website, you can blow up the map and see it a lot better. But what I wanted to show you here is the blue dot at the bottom, again, the Glendale crossroads, and Longstreet's attack and Hill's attack down there close to the blue dot. You can see that they had to traverse not only woods, but also some creeks and swampy terrain. It was very rough going. It was and in this size battle, again, remember, this is pretty early in the war, and Lee was working with some generals he hadn't worked with before, including Jackson. It was enormously difficult to coordinate over this size of terrain and this type of terrain the movements of the various divisions that Lee needed to, and it was just a very disjointed attack. The bluish purple lines you see there, the Union positions, and up at the top you can see the yellow dot. That's where White Oak Swamp Bridge was, and that's where Jackson was supposed to come across and hit the Union position in the north. But Jackson, again, very difficult to get him to move. Franklin's corps was up there guarding that. They had a great position. Jackson didn't want to try to push his men across against artillery and infantry across difficult terrain, but didn't really listen to some of his scouts and subordinates about other fords they found that would work just as well. So in the end, it was kind of a sprawling battle where the Union and Union Army, Confederate Army lost about the same. Lee, again, another lost opportunity to destroy a significant part of McClellan's command, and the Union Army continues its retreat toward Harrison's Landing on the James via Malvern Hill, which we'll get to next. So let's go to the next slide. So the last battle of the 7 days was on July 1st at Malvern Hill. And by the way, Glendale and Malvern Hill, most of these battles we've been talking about, except Seven Pines, Seven Savages Stations, are all part of the National Park Service. And in addition, particularly around Glendale and Malvern Hill, there have been other organizations, preservation organizations, that have done a terrific job saving a lot of land in that area. So I encourage you to go out there and see these places, particularly Malvern Hill. And what I wanted to point out here in this section, this illustration, which was done just after the battle, this shows the high ground on Malvern Hill on the left with Union artillery blasting away at the advancing Confederate lines coming from the right. But you can also see the gunboats over on the river. Those are Union ships that are hitting the Confederates from the river. And that was a significant part of stopping part of the Confederate attack was that naval action. Okay, let's move on. We'll cover this and wrap up here as soon as we can, but I'll give you the details here. The high ground here, you can see where Porter's name is. That's Malvern Hill. And Lee's idea was a series of frontal assaults against the high ground by the units you see here coming from the north at Glendale. So very, very basic battle plan. And again, a curious way of Lee trying to maneuver or attack or force the Federals off Malvern Hill, which was guaranteed to be a casualty producing, and doesn't really have the same kind of tactical creativity that we would see later at Chancellorsville and other battles and parts of campaigns, including Gettysburg. So the Confederates, in a nutshell, were very straight ahead, line after line, trying to get at Porter and force him off of there so that they could attack, again, the Union column as they retreated. But again, this was really a straight up hit. I think the next map is probably more interesting. It's a little harder to read, but I think you can get a feel for it. On the left, again, that's another period map by the same artist and map maker that's been drawing these that I've been showing you. And rather than worry about the names of everybody on this map, which I'm sure you can't see, I can't see them either, but just focus on the color. Up at the top are the Confederate Union units that had come down from Glendale and White Oak Swamp. We just talked about that battle the day before. Over on the left are the troops that Lee was hoping would move against the west side of Malvern Hill. Those are under Magruder and Holmes. And then you can see that arc on the north end of Malvern Hill of all blue, and the kind of the beauty of this position, if you're a northerner, is not only do you have the high ground with lots of artillery, but you also have a creek that acts as a defensive position on the east side of the battlefield on our right, and also swampy low ground with creeks running through this area on the left. So very, very good position. This is a picture there of the Union position against which the Confederates attacked in the center of the battlefield, part of the Park Service property here. But this represents the Northern artillery, which devastated many, many rows of Confederate troops coming up. This is where the quote from the beginning, where General D.H. Hill said it wasn't war, it was murder. Let's look at the next slide, please. So this is a kind of a summary of the last of the 7 days battles of Malvern Hill, is Lee's attack. It was very uncoordinated. Some of the troops, including Holmes down on the River Road, didn't really get in the battle at all. There was Navy gun support for the Union position, particularly on the southwest corner of Malvern Hill. And the artillery here was particularly effective and repulsed assault after assault. Again, McClellan not on this battlefield. Porter felt like he had defeated the Confederates, which he did. He repulsed every attack. They had basically given up toward the evening hours, and Porter was sending back messages to McClellan that, hey, we won, we defeated them. So the messages went back to McClellan, but he ordered Porter to withdraw that evening. And you can see that the Confederate losses were almost double the Union losses in here. So again, another Northern defeat in the way that withdrawing from the battlefield to Harrison's Landing would make it a defeat. All right, so let's have the next slide, please. We're going to wrap up here with a few more. Just want to show this period image of the Union gunboats that were firing toward the background. We're looking at the rear of their firing, but kind of a nice image demonstrating what that looked like. Next image. Okay, this is the retreat to Harrison's Landing. There's Berkeley Plantation that was at Harrison's Landing. Harrison's Landing is on the James River there, right on the bottom of that map. You can see it says Harrison's Landing. The Union troops at Malvern Hill retreated there. You can see Malvern Hill is that topographical feature on the top left of your screen. And the Confederates started to come after them, but McClellan had engineered a great position. They were supported again by Navy ships. And this incidentally is where Taps was written, the famous military evening song, which is now associated with military funerals. So that is the end of the 7 days battles. Lee victorious, but almost 20,000 casualties out of less than 100,000. That's not sustainable, particularly for the Confederacy. McClellan regarded it as one of the greatest military achievements of all time. He would. He turned a retreat into a victory in his own mind. But by August, Lincoln had visited Harrison's Landing. The chief of the Army, Major General Henry Halleck, visited McClellan, and they both were convinced that they were going to be unable to get McClellan to move, that this was it. He was not going to be going against Richmond again. So after they got back to Washington, by the middle of August, they ordered McClellan to extract his army from the peninsula and bring it back to Alexandria, Virginia, by way of the Potomac River, and also to Aquia Landing, which is near Fredericksburg. But clearly a defeat for McClellan, who was not able to capture Richmond with probably the best equipped, organized, and manpower army of the cause, the Union cause, the Civil War up to that point. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions. I hope you enjoyed it. I know we went fast, so let's see about some questions here. Let's see. If McClellan was largely absent from the field of battle, did he delegate on-scene command to one of his subordinates? If so, who? If not, why not? Great question. Now we've covered that to some extent, but I will answer that. The answer is at Gaines's Mill and Beaver Dam Creek, really the only corps commander north of the river was Porter. So Porter was in command. The problem started happening at Savage's Station, where McClellan wasn't there. He left no one in charge. So you had Sumner and Heintzelman and drawing a blank on the third Union commander there at the time, maybe Porter, not Porter. There was no one in command, and each corps commander did what they thought, including Heintzelman, who at some point during the day in the afternoon decided, well, he wasn't going to be doing any good here. He moved his entire corps off the battlefield, never told Sumner. No one was left in command at Glendale also. In a way, psychological history is very dangerous, and it's just very speculative. But we can ask the questions: why wasn't McClellan there? Why was he afraid of the battlefield? Was he afraid of getting killed? I don't know. He served in action during the Mexican War. He knew what combat was. Was he afraid to see his men, or reluctant to see his men killed and shot down? Who knows? It's all guess. But it's a great question in general, and I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, is it correct? Lost the question. Hold on 1 second there. Let me get back up to that one. Is it correct that President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton were skeptical of McClellan's amphibious assault during the Peninsula Campaign? Yes, absolutely. What they were worried about is that if McClellan took all the army from in front of Washington and in the kind of the Centerville, Manassas area, and brought it by water from Alexandria all the way down the Potomac River into the bay, and then up the James River, wouldn't Johnston, the Confederate commander at the time, wouldn't he use that opportunity to attack the Union capital, the Northern capital? They were very worried about that. And one of the things they did is tell McClellan, listen, we'll go along with this plan, but you got to leave enough troops to guard Washington. So McClellan assured them, and he outlined his plan to leave about 70,000 troops near Washington. Well, he played fast and loose with the numbers, because he included troops that were garrisoning Annapolis and Baltimore. He included the Union troops that were actually out trying to fight Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley, the Harper's Ferry garrison. So Lincoln and Halleck decided to keep one corps that was supposed to be moving overland by way of Fredericksburg to join Porter on the northern flank. It would have added, I'm approximating here, but 35 to 40,000 more troops. It would have added that. They kept them in front of Richmond instead. In front of Washington instead. And McClellan never forgave Lincoln or Halleck for that. He thought that leaving McDowell up in Richmond, Lincoln was trying to sabotage the campaign. So he never forgave him for that. Good question. Let's see. Next question. Weren't the frontal assaults successful during the Mexican-American War? There were a number of frontal assaults on Mexican positions, including fortified towns and cities. But if you'll remember, particularly Winfield Scott's Mexico City campaign from Veracruz all the way to Mexico City, a lot of the times, in fact, that's what Robert Lee was doing for a good bit of his time, was finding ways around Mexican positions, around flanks to get in the rear of the Mexican army a significant number of times. So I'd say the answer is yes, but there was also an emphasis on maneuver and flanking attacks that was significant. Can Malvern Hill be considered the Army of Virginia's Fredericksburg? Sure, you could. Yes, I think that would be possible. Again, Fredericksburg was a battle, for those of you not familiar with it, in February, December of 1862 at Fredericksburg, Virginia, where frontal assaults against fixed Confederate positions really devastated a significant number of that. Yeah, you could definitely say that. Okay, let's get to the next one. I think we got one more in this series of combats in the Virginia theater. How quickly do reports, military and/or media get back to Washington, hence to other northern cities? Were there daily updates? Not really. Good question. Now, interestingly, McClellan was telegraphing back to Washington, to Lincoln and Halleck, saying the Army has acted brilliantly. We repulsed the Confederates here. We held on here. The men are in good spirits and all this stuff. But he was retreating, so he was putting on the best face many times. He also telegraphed a famous telegraph. I don't have the exact text of it. I'll have to paraphrase this. Back to Washington, saying after one of the battles, I believe it was Gaines's Mill, that had I had more men, we would have been completely victorious. I've done my best to save the army, and you all in Washington have done your best to sacrifice it. Not really what you want to be sending back to the commander-in-chief of the army and the commander-in-chief of all military forces, the president. So good question. I appreciate that. Okay, we're going to wrap up here.